a formal introduction and?
I'll formally introduce myself.
Okay,
to the crowd.
that's
Yeah.
fine.
We should move up so you don't have to.
Yeah, I know.
We're gonna be a cozy group, so.
I was really surprised. I've had a couple of things with like really small town libraries. And I think, oh, I don't know. And I get there and the whole place will be crowded.
Yeah.
Because it's the only thing going on.
Right.
It's like, oh, this is kind of cool.
And that's the trouble with Ellsworth, there's so
Yeah.
much going on here, so much going on.
I think a holiday weekend coming up.
Right.
Definitely,
Yeah.
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 So-
We're enjoying the holiday weekend.
And I think we're a big enough area geographically, we're not like a cozy, smaller community where
Yeah.
everybody knows everybody,
Mhm.
everybody pulls together, we're a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah. I actually went to college at University of Maine at Machias.
Oh,
Oh, my dad
wow.
grew up there.
Really? See, we were just meant to
I
be
don't think
friends,
so.
I know.
I don't think so.
I think that's a great title for your book,
What?
the guest book.
Oh. Meant to be friends?
No, it's funny because I have a friend who has a summer home and they have a guest book. But,
Yeah.
you know, you have to really push it in front of people to get them to sign it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You know, I always sign them because I'm like, oh, this is really
I
nice.
think people like to read other people's signs.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
I don't want them to read.
Are you folks chilly, you want to cut these off?
Yeah.
It gets stuffy.
I'm
so
gonna have to
if
start jumping
you
up and
start
down.
going like
No.
this,
Good.
if it gets
Yeah.
stuffy,
Oh,
well, I'll turn it back on.
Well, it's stuffy.
I'll try not to be stuffy.
The Wednesday Painters Group. They
Nice variety.
Isn't this great? It's absolutely gorgeous. And there's more on the back wall too.
Wow.
Just all
And
kinds
these
of.
are all amateurs, right? I mean,
Huh?
yeah.
Amateurs in the true sense of the word.
Usually on the back wall, they do a theme. One year they did windows, they've done
Yes, I
doors.
remember that.
They've done a photograph where each person painted their interpretation of the photograph. This year, they've done irises where each person gave a rendition of irises. And this year I think it's painting in 2 colors, so most of those are basically 2 colors.
Oh.
So they try to do a different thing.
And I used to do that with my quilt group. We would do, like everybody would do the same quilt pattern, but everybody would pick their own
Material.
fabrics, and then everything would be completely different. And then
Mhm.
some people would be like, well, you know, I try to follow the directions, but it didn't really work very well, so theirs would be completely different from everybody else's. Which is fun.
This is pretty with the sunflower. Rebecca's out the window? Is that what we're looking at?
Blue.
I think so.
Yeah.
Right, Susan's.
We've got a few different varieties of them.
Pretty.
Right, you ready to go? Okay, let's just go. So my name is Carolyn Brink, if you didn't know, that's who I am. I am by day, I used to be by day an accountant, and now I know, 35 years, boy, my hair is gray. And recently I have taken on what is really the job I should have probably been doing for years, which is museum director for Rufus Porter Museum in Bridgeton. And Rufus Porter is a fascinating guy. If you ever get a chance to learn about him, he was an inventor and an artist and the founder of Scientific American. Fascinating guy. Anyway, so I mentioned already that I went to college at University of Maine at Machias, and I came from Bridgeton and to go there by a long roundabout route. And while I was at University of Maine at Machias, I had a variety of opportunities to go to Bar Harbor and cruise around that area, and to come to Ellsworth and Bangor, because of course in Machias, you know, there's not much going on up there, especially for a young college person, so getting out of town is often a good thing. So years went by, and I went off all over the place, and then I've lived a strange life. We all have, but I eventually ended up back in Bridgeton, but I still always really loved Bar Harbor and the whole area, and it's just, to me, it's a perfect place because you've got mountains, you've got the ocean, you've got lakes, you've got a cute little downtown. It's just a great town. So I was going to come up to Bar Harbor for a vacation. Well, somewhere in the midst of getting ready to come up for that vacation, I had this friend, and he and I started to think that perhaps we should be more than friends, right? So I invited him along on the trip, and it was kind of a, let's see if there's anything here that's worth moving forward with. And so we came up to Bar Harbor. We stayed actually in Bass Harbor at a little cabbage, that's a cabin cottage, for those of you who don't know.
Opposite, right?
Yes, a cabbage. Not literally a cabbage. But so we were staying in this little cottage, and I was taking a shower. And all of a sudden, I got this complete story, like, this is what's going to happen. It's a story about these people, and they come and they stay in this cottage, and there's this woman that owns the cottage, and she's kind of the story that weaves through the whole thing. And I was like, okay. So I jumped out of the shower and ran through the cabbage. Sorry, even to me that sounded funny. I put a towel on just to keep it clean here. And I scribbled down all this stuff, and it was like all these, the characters in the book and the story and what each person's story was, and I was like, okay, wow. And I turned to the person that I was with, and I was like, I just had this story and this idea and this thing, and he was like, okay. All right. So I went back home, and the person that I went with, that I thought perhaps there was something there, we ended up getting married like 3 months later. And this book was still sitting there, and I wasn't going to do anything with it at that point because I was making a living, I was an accountant, I had all this stuff going on, and it just wouldn't leave me alone. It just would not leave me alone. So I just sat down and I started writing, and I'm like, okay, I'll just see where this goes. And from the time that I had that idea in the shower to the point where it had gone to the editor was about 84 days. So it's kind of like the difference between a really long labor and a really short labor. It was intense, and it was like, okay, obviously this story wants to be told. So, okay, we'll just do that. So at the core, the book is really about people encountering difficult things in their lives, and they have to figure out what to do with that. So, for example, maybe one of them wants to start a family, and her husband isn't really ready to do that. So maybe there's a little series of episodes with that, or somebody who's suffered a loss. So every person in the book has some sort of loss that they've suffered, and they're trying to figure out what to do about that. So they each come, it's a series of 4 weeks, and they each come to this cabbage, trying to just get a break from their lives and sort of sort things out after some sort of a loss or a difficulty in their lives. So it tells the story of each person as they come to the cottage, and they're interacting with the owner of the cottage, a woman named Dominique, who has her own secret story that, is gradually revealed as things go on. So it became a story that was about finding peace and being in a place where that peace was possible to come to you. And certainly Acadia is a wonderful place for that to happen. So I wrote this book, and I sent it off to be published, and it came back to me, and I gave a copy to my mother. And my mother was somebody who was she was not a person who gave a lot of praise or gave praise easily. And she said to me, and this was, the guest book was my 9th book. It was the first time she ever mentioned anything about one of my books. She said, that was a really good book.
Had you written a lot of fiction before then, but you've written
Yes.
a lot
I was mostly a historical fiction.
Yeah.
And then I got a couple of business books that I wrote, which you probably will never read because they're about accounting. I mean, let's be honest. So she said, it was really good. And I said, oh. And she said, it was so good, I read it over again. I said, oh my goodness. And I said, who was your favorite character? And she said, Dominique. I said, okay, all right. So, well, this is actually her copy of the book right here. So I wrote this book that's about healing and coming back from grief or difficulties or whatever. And then my brother was diagnosed with stage 4 renal cancer. My stepson was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. And then my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. So at one point in time, all 3 of them were in the hospital and not doing well. So I was supposed to come up here to do a talk last year in June, and all of this was going on. So I had to postpone it until August, and there was still too much going on. So I said, I just can't. But then Sandy came back and she was like, but you still have to come. And I said, okay. I said, oh gosh, I hate when I have to go up to Mount Desert Island. It's just so horrible. So we did make it. So my stepson died the 1st of June and my mother died the 2nd of July. My brother, I'm seeing him this weekend. He's doing well. He's probably going to always live with cancer and always have to undergo treatments, but he's doing well. So anyway, it was kind of interesting to me that I wrote this book about people having to deal with difficulties and trying to come back and trying to heal and all of this sort of thing. And then I ended up needing to read the book myself. And I said, well, okay, that's... So now I'm a little nervous about what ideas I'm going to get while I'm here, because who knows what that's going to foreshadow in my own life. But for me, there's just this fascination with how people go through horrendous situations and still go on to have some sort of a quality of life. You know, I think about people who have survived the Holocaust. Like, how do they then go back into society and, having seen the worst of people, and have to look at people in the grocery store and wonder, you know, is this a person that could have allowed something like that to happen? Because it's just interesting to me. People are fascinating. People are really, really interesting. And I love to kind of, what's your story? What's your story? What's your story? Because everybody has one. So I'm constantly fascinated by that. Like, how do you deal with that kind of loss? Or if you lose someone that you love, how do you deal with that loss? And people choose different ways. And I was talking to a woman over the summer, and she was talking about a friend of ours who had lost her husband, and he died very suddenly. He was hiking and died from a cardiac event. And she was devastated, of course. I mean, and they were very, very close. So this mutual friend of ours was talking about that, and she was saying that, you know, this woman she just needs to get over it. Wow, really? And I said, you know, I don't think that's really fair. And she said, well, I saw this other friend of mine in Europe. She lost her husband and she was going all over Europe and just having a great time. There's nothing wrong with her. I said, well, maybe she didn't like her husband. I don't know. But I think in this country we kind of had this this attitude that, you know, the thing happens, you do your grieving thing, and then you move on. You know, you just get over it and keep going. And I don't think it's fair to expect anybody to do that, and I don't think that it's realistic. And everybody grieves and heals differently. And we don't really take time in our society to respect that. You know, you take 3 days off from work and then you get back to it. You know, and I think that's unrealistic. But anyway, that's just my little soapbox moment, and I'm done now, mostly. pretty much over. So this book really kind of takes a look at that, like how can you come back from that, and what does healing look like for different people, and how long does it take? You know, how long does it take to get from point A to point B, and that point where, you know, you're not sobbing yourself to sleep every night, and you start to be able to function in society again on more than just like a hi, how are you? It's difficult. But the message of the book, I really wanted to make sure that it was a message of hope, that there is life after difficult things, and that you can grow around it. You never maybe get over it, but you can grow around it, and you can create a good and positive life. And Dominique was somebody who had suffered a great loss, but she was able to turn that into creating a space for other people to find healing and to find some peace again. And I loved the message of Dominique. This was a character that just came out of nowhere. I mean, literally, I was like, I had no idea who this woman is. I've had that happen a couple of times. This historical fiction series that I did, there's a woman named Mathilde, and she came out of nowhere. And I said to her, because I talked to them, okay. I said to her, is it Mathilde or Matilda? And she said, it's Mathilde. And I said, okay. And she told me her story, that being that she was a slave and she escaped. And she came through the woods and the forests and through the swamps in order to get to a safe place. And I had no idea where she came from. I was like, okay, that's fantastic. I didn't even know where she belonged in what book at that point. I just knew that she had a story and she was knocking on the door. And I said, okay. So as I was doing research for that book, it's called Beneath Freedom's Wing, and it's about abolition and the Underground Railroad, which came through Bridgeton. So there's big Sebago Lake, and there were two tracks that went up around Sebago Lake and met up in Bridgeton. And whichever one was safer, they would send them on that particular route. So anyway, as I was doing the research for it, the main character in the book, one of them is a woman named Phoebe Beach Fessenden. And she was the wife of a pastor who was an abolitionist. And I was doing this research and I came across a letter that she had written, and it was all about a woman who has escaped from slavery and comes through, and the whole story was right there in her letter. She was talking about how she escapes and she's, you know, sleeping with poisonous reptiles at night, and it's safer for her than being around humans. And the whole story, and I was looking at that, I was like, wow, that's Mathilde's story right there. And so I brought that into the book and just turned Mathilde into that, like Dominique, she's a ribbon that kind of weaves the whole story together. And so that was another one that kind of popped up out of nowhere. And then another one that I really enjoyed meeting came from the guest book as well. It's a woman named Mary Winslow. And Mary Winslow, she was just like a throwaway character. Like there's a woman in the book that worked for a publishing firm, and she was assigned to work with this particular author who was quite an interesting person. So she was just like a nobody to me, and then all of a sudden I was like, wow, she's really something. The dialogue started coming out, and an assistant came in to help and said, oh, I'll get you a cup of tea. And the woman said, yes, it has to be Earl Grey, and make sure it's prepared properly. And the woman comes back in with a microwaved cup of tea, and Mary Winslow says, now dear, that is just not the way that we do it. And she just turned into this person who was like so judgmental, but right, you know. She was, when the woman came in who had a lot of tattoos and piercings, and she was like, oh no, dear, oh no, dear. Gentlemen do not like women that look like that. So she ended up being this whole incredible other person. And the reason that she was writing a book is because she was accused of running a senior citizen brothel. And so the newspapers picked up on it, and they started calling her the Naughty Nana. So Mary Winslow's getting her own book. It's already in the works, and it's going to be called The Confessions of the Naughty Nana. And although it says, one of my friends said, "Are you writing porn?" Like, no, I'm not writing porn, believe me. But it's more about how we treat old folks. And when you pass a certain age, you stop being interesting. And this used to drive me crazy when I was a kid reading books. And I remember reading the Kent Family Chronicles, which came out in like the 1970s, around the time of the bicentennial. It was a whole series. And they would talk about in the first book it would be, oh, it's this generation. And then the next book it would be like, well, that was that generation. They're no longer important because they're the old generation. So I remember thinking, well, that's not very nice. You know, people get more interesting as they get older. People are libraries, they're fascinating. So she was another character that kind of popped out, and I'm sure there will be more. There's also a church mouse that came out of nowhere. It's a whole other thing. So for me,
book?
Pardon me?
Is that a children's book?
Yeah, it's actually it's a series of 3 books. And they're all letters that the church mouse writes to his congregation. So they've got this whole life under the floorboards that the people don't know about. So this church mouse, the church was about to close in real life. And so this church mouse said, we've got to do something because our snacks are going to go away and they're not going to heat the place anymore. It's really going to be impacting our lives a lot. So he broke the code and basically started writing letters to his church folks. And he ended up actually being an amazing fundraiser. And those books helped to get a new steeple and a new bathroom and a septic and a well. And he was really a gold mine. He was really quite a mouse. Some mouse he was, and still is. So anyway, it ended up being a series of 3 books of these letters that have been collected. So his name is Pearlie. Not like Pearlie Gates, but like Pearlie, the founder of Bridgeton. So that's where his name comes from. He was another surprising character. I'm sure there'll be more. I was just, when we were driving over here, I said, I just had a book idea. And he says, oh, okay, already? But I was looking at the loose strife that's all along the road, and I was thinking about escaped ornamentals. And I've just been talking about that with somebody else about Japanese knotweed and kudzu, and how they do it because they think it's pretty and whatever, and then it escapes and it just crowds out the native plants. So anyway, I was thinking, escaped ornamental. Oh, what if there was a woman who was like a trophy wife, and then she left that life and went to a different life, so she was an escaped ornamental. So who knows where that will go. We'll see if she tracks me down while we're up here. Like, remember you were going to write about me?
It's fascinating to me that for somebody who uses one side of their brain most of the time is using the creative side of their brain now.
And for me, it's actually, it's kind of crosses over, especially with the historical fiction, because I love doing research. So I love going to libraries and museums and digging into the old letters and reading about this and that, and then you add the history to it. What was the context that this person, what was the context of their life? What was going on in the country, in the neighborhood? One of the books I just wrote, everybody died of tuberculosis. I don't, it's spoiler alert, but tuberculosis was horrible. Like in the 19th century, it killed so many people, and so many of them were young. So that for me was fascinating, but absolutely heartbreaking. Like when I finished writing that book, I felt like I needed to take maybe, I don't know, a week someplace in a room. Because it was just heartbreaking. All these young women some men, but particularly young women, like the Bronte sisters, it was the same kind of thing, where 4 of them plus their brother died of consumption, leaving one sister, Charlotte. So I was, when I'm doing this kind of research, and I'm on Amazon, and I might buy a book about tuberculosis, and then my recommendations will come up. Oh, well, you might be interested in the white plague. You might be interested in the black plague. I'm like, but for me, it's that, I love that crossover, where it's the creative people in my head and then putting the foundation under them. So that's where the analytical part of it comes in. It's that researching and getting these different pieces, finding this letter in this library and this diary in that library, and you kind of start to build the foundation of what these people's lives might have been like, and then you kind of put in a little, add a little personality to the dead people and bring
How do
it
you
back
know
to
where
life.
to look?
Oh, that's the fun part.
It almost sounds like you're literally, in your brain anyway, writing 2 different books. I mean, different
Yeah.
and you are.
Yeah.
Do you actually write 2 at the same time, or go back to one and then on another? Because
You
it
know,
sounds like your mind skips
I've
around.
tried,
That's hard to do.
and it takes me longer to get them all done.
Sure.
So at one point, I actually published 3 books in 1 year. I had
Yeah.
one that I finally finished. I had one that was pretty close to done, and I finished it. And then I had one that I wrote from scratch. And the bad thing about finishing and publishing 3 books in 1 year is that then you know that you can. And then it's like,
Pressure.
remember that year that you did those 3 books, really, and you only did 1 this year? So right now, yeah, there are several books. They're in there, the people. And interestingly, sometimes they cross over, and I'm like, wait a minute. Get out of there. So right now I'm working on the Naughty Nana one. There's one called The Mostly True Adventures of Salad Girl, partially autobiographical from my time working as a salad girl in Florida restaurants.
Oh.
What else am I working on? I don't even remember. Naughty Nana, The Salad Girl. There's like 3 or 4 of them, 4 or 5, 6 or 8 of them. I don't know. The problem is, like, I got to follow it through. The guest book was easy because that was like, you are going to write this. You're sitting down and you're writing this. I'm hoping that the Naughty Nana is the next one that I'm going to finish. She really needs me to do that. And it's interesting for me because it starts with them, with Naughty Nana, Mary Winslow, and her friends when they're young. And they are coming of age at the same time that Pearl Harbor happens. So I'm having to do research on the Second World War and what things would have been like for them. And that's kind of hard because it's not, like, I've spent a lot of time in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, but I haven't spent a lot of time in World War II. So there's a whole lot of research that has to happen with that. And then it flashes forward to current times when they're dealing with their alleged brothel and a whole court case involved with that. It's a court case of the century. It's a whole thing. And there's also the legal stuff that I have to kind of put together, like, okay, I might need a lawyer to help me with that. So yeah, it's crowded in there sometimes. So, what else? I think that there will be more books like the guest book that are more contemporary or contemporary / historic at the same time. I think there'll be more books like that because I really enjoyed working with that book, and it was a pleasure to me. It wasn't, sometimes the historical fiction can get to be, you can get really bogged down in the research. Because you never want to stop researching. You're like, well, I know there's one more fact or detail out there. I just know there is. So that can lead you down a lot of rabbit holes. But as far as the research and knowing where to find things, there's so much. There's so much. And the trick is really, how much time do you want to spend on the road or on the computer going through this stuff? So when I was doing the Bridgeton history books, Bridgeton Historical Society has a lot of letters from Enoch Purley, who was one of the main characters. They're from his brother, actually, written by his brother to Enoch Purley. And then Peabody Essex Museum has a lot of Purley family letters as well. And I went down there and I'm sitting there reading, in Bridgeton I've been reading about this copper pot that Thomas Purley was trying to find for his brother. And I went down to Peabody Essex and I'm reading the letters and they're talking about this copper pot. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So Peabody Essex has the Enoch Purley written letters, and Bridgeton Historical Society has the Thomas Purley written letters. So an extremely unusual situation where you have people that were not famous, they were just regular people. To have both sides of the conversation preserved is fantastic. So for the town of Bridgeton, it's fantastic because we have so much documentation of what was going on in the town over all of the years. So it's been really terrific. And then Bowdoin College has a huge amount of letters and diaries and all kinds of paperwork written by people who went to Bowdoin College, and then when they died, their papers got donated. But the Fessenden family, who was the Beneath Freedom's Wing people, the abolition people, part of their family moved out to Ohio and another state out there. So there are museums out in the Midwest that have letters from people here in Maine. So they took them, they spread out, and as the family members spread out, they wrote back and forth, keeping each other up to date on what was going on in their lives. So there's a huge amount of information. And there are a variety of databases that you can use to try to find stuff. And I'm still finding stuff. I'm still finding stuff about this book, which was the first book in the series. And this was a Civil War related book, a diary of a young woman who lived in Bridgeton. She started keeping a diary in 1857. And so this book is built around her diary. And I'm still finding information. I'm like, I wish I'd known that then. But the good thing is I can always update the book. So that's a fantastic thing in my spare time. So it's amazing to me how much is available. And then I also have a lot of family trees that I keep on Ancestry.com. So you can have multiple family trees. It's wonderful. So I've got a Beach family tree and a Purley family tree and a Fessenden family tree. And then people will reach out to me and say, I see that you have my great-great-grandfather as one of the people in your tree, what's your relationship? And I go, there is no relationship, they're just people. So they're not related to me, that I know of. But I think